Uh, Morning, everyone. Welcome to my talk about Htmx and why, if you use it, you might not necessarily need to reach for a SPA or a single-page application like React or Angular or Vue or those sorts of things. My name's Duncan. I am an Aussie front-end dev. I work for the government at the moment, building design systems and web components. But today I'm going to be talking about something I'm not using at work, but something I'm using in a side business of mine, which is Htmx. So this side business is a nutrition application. I've got about 1,000 customers. It's not like a massive enterprise app, but we've had it for like 15 years. And the way I've found myself to Htmx is through its simplicity, because we've got this, about 5 years old. It's been written from, from web forms to, to different things. And it's in Angular at the moment. We're like, we pick it up every so often. It's so complex. It's like right in that 2018 phase of Redux and Angular and every single library extension and observables you can imagine, and trying to hire a contractor to turn up and help. They're just like, where do I start with this thing? So we got really excited about this because this is something that's a much simpler approach. And I think that's kind of the theme of today of looking at Htmx. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So just a quick show of hands, who's using Htmx in production at the moment? Okay, so the one person I did meet actually went to another talk because he's like, I'm using it every day for a year now. I like wake up and I think about it. So you're all in the right room, because this talk is really about like starting with Htmx. I've heard about it. I've maybe seen some demos on YouTube or something like that. This is a very hot topic. But where do I go from here? What are the things I need to know about whether or not I should even waste any more time like looking into this or not? So we've got some code demos and a whole bunch of stuff to look at. We're going to start off kind of talking about, what is Htmx? How does it work? And Htmx is really the tool, whereas Hypermedia, you'll hear me talk about, is the pattern. So we'll talk a whole bunch about that. And why this pattern is good. Why would Hypermedia be something useful for your apps? Not every app, but maybe some apps. And then we'll talk about in code some of the common patterns that you're going to need to be aware of to do beyond just the very first steps of doing Htmx and swapping some HTML into the client. And then we'll look at the glue code that you're going to inevitably need a little bit of glue code. Probably 90% of the JavaScript that you're normally writing for your front ends, you're not going to write if you're using Htmx. But there's inevitably a little bit of scripting you'll still need to do in the client, about 10%. So what are your options for when you need to do that little bit that's not going to be done by Htmx? So what exactly is Htmx? Well, it is a front-end JavaScript framework, because that's important to say, because a lot of people are like, yeah, but don't I get to choose my backend and I write like lots of server code? And that's true. But ultimately, once you've written that HTML on the server with those Htmx attributes, when it lands on the client, that's where the JavaScript that is Htmx runs. And it's really a framework. You can go read about this on their site. They kind of talk about libraries versus frameworks, because after you've done 6-12 months of development in it, you're pretty committed. It's going to really be a significant way of developing your app, much more of a framework than just a library. So how does it work? What's kind of the basic model of like, you've got your database, you've got all your state in your database, and then in your server, you go and grab that state, you do some business logic to it. The big difference between this approach with Htmx and Hypermedia versus what we're all doing currently with our front-end apps, which is totally fine, is rather than making JSON, you make HTML on the server. So kind of old school, you make that HTML and you send the HTML directly to the client. So it's already pre-done on the server. You send it down with Htmx and it just runs that HTML that you've sent down. And there's a big gap here on the client side next to running that HTML, which is kind of what we're all currently doing, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But all of your SPA work would normally be there. So you do a lot less stuff, and that's kind of the core of Htmx and why it's so much simpler. And then when Htmx, or when your web app's running and you interact with it and events are raised, Htmx has these little attributes, which I'll show you in a second, that then send fetch requests or AJAX requests back to your server, and you respond again with HTML, little bits of HTML. So it runs in the client. It's a JavaScript framework, but it gives you the power to use any backend you want and spend most of your time writing your backend code and making HTML on the server. What you use to make that HTML, it doesn't really matter. It's up to you and the server that you're using or the language you choose. So these are the little Htmx attributes. There's 4 kind of main ones you'll see quite a bit. So this is just an example of a button. A button normally can't do an AJAX request. You can't say like a get or a href like you would with an anchor tag. But here we can put this hx post on it, point to our to-dos endpoint, and do a post with a button. And you can say, well, what do I want to trigger this post? I want to trigger it when the button's clicked. Now, if you've used Htmx, you'll realize you probably don't need to put this trigger attribute on here, because Htmx will know, hey, you're on a button. The most likely thing that you want to listen to is a click. So, but I've put it here for clarity. So when you click this button, it's going to make a request out to your server, just a normal AJAX request. And your server's going to respond with a little bit of HTML. Let's just say just a single list item. And then you're going to need to sprinkle on more attributes onto your button here. So you might put on a hx target to say, I'm going to get this li from my server. Where do I want to target to put this little piece of HTML? So I want to target a thing, something with an ID of list on it. So I might have an unordered list, an ID on it, and I want to target that. So I want to swap this little bit of HTML I'm getting back from the server into this unordered list. And then you've got another attribute called hx swap that describes the type of swap where you want to put this HTML. So here we're saying after the beginning. So find the unordered list, and then right afterwards, before the other li items, inject this little piece of HTML. So it's very kind of rudimentary. It's not complex stuff. And most of these hx swap arguments that you would use are just based on normal DOM APIs using insert adjacent HTML of before begin, before end, after end, inner HTML, outer HTML, and you've just learned most of the API for HTMX in like 5 minutes. So it's super simple. There's heaps more to it. We'll get into it. But this is kind of the premise of what you do, and it's this simplicity that makes it so cool. So I click the button, send back that li, I jam it into this unordered list, and then every time I click it, it does it again. But every trip is another trip back to my server to get that little bit of HTML and process it. I'm not doing it on the client. Ooh. So how's this different to a single page application? Well, HTML is the big difference here. So this is what we've just been looking at, that we make HTML on the server and send it down. But the difference here is that, you know, we get our state, we process it with our business logic, but we make JSON. That's kind of the status quo at the moment. And there's nothing wrong with that. We're running all of our businesses and all of our jobs are based on this idea. And I don't think this is going to go away. I don't think Htmx is going to be this thing that's going to make everyone go, oh my God, what were we doing for 10 years? Or for longer. But I think it is going to have an impact for the certain person who's looking or has a certain type of app where they want to do something simpler or different or stay in their server-side language. So the real craziness here that makes you either fall in love or hate HTMX, because it's one of those topics that you either fall in one camp, people don't tend to be like, oh, it's okay. People tend to love it or hate it, is this bit. You have to get your JSON down to the client, and then you have to take that JSON, process the state in there with JavaScript, then save that state. So you've got a copy of the state now in your database and in the client, and then you've got to make the HTML with the JavaScript from the JSON, and then run your HTML. And it's not crazy, is it? We do it every day at work, but you could just skip that whole entire step if you just want to do something a bit simpler and use HTMX and do it on the server. So that's what we're going to be looking at lots today. And I really think for me, it's not just the simplicity of being able to do this and use any backend. State management is really difficult in client-side apps. We've got lots of different ways of doing it. You know, you've got Redux, you've got signals, you've got observables, you name it. So this just takes all of that away because your state is inside the HTML. And I actually wanted to call this talk Hypermedia and why you don't always need to return JSON, because that's really what we're talking about. HTMX isn't this massive shizzly shining thing that does amazing stuff. It is, I shouldn't say it isn't, but it's just the tool. The pattern we're looking at here is Hypermedia, and the idea of just returning the JSON, not returning JSON and just returning the HTML ready to go. And it's based on this premise of HTOS or hypermedia as an engine of application state. So basically your states in your HTML. I'm not going to go into this. You can just go read it on their website. But some of you are probably sitting here going, isn't this just what we were doing like 10 or 15 years ago with PHP? Who's kind of thinking that at the moment? Yeah, a bunch of people. And that's exactly what it is. With a little bit of special JavaScript to do some of this not having to refresh the whole page stuff, which we'll look at. So I'm probably underselling HTMX here a lot. But it is pretty awesome, and you'll see it be awesome. And I think, yeah, it's exciting. So go to their website and it will say, we give you all of these things, Ajax, CSS transitions, WebSockets, server-side events, just with those attributes. You don't have any JavaScript to write. It's pretty tiny. It's only 14 kilobytes gzipped. So it's a lot smaller than almost all the other frameworks out there. And that's going to get cached. It's a single file, so it's got no performance issues. And it kind of came from this idea of Hypermedia where they said an anchor tag and a form, they can do get and post, but they have to refresh the whole page. And they can only listen to events like click and submit, and you can't put them on any element. And when they do fire, they have to refresh the whole page. So the premise is like, well, that's awesome that I've got anchor tags and form tags to do this, but what if I could listen to any event and I could post any sort of method, including patch, delete, and puts, and post, and gets, and I could put it on any element, even, God help us, divs, and I can, not refresh the whole page. So that's the premise, is you get this supercharged HTML because of HTMX with attributes that turn everything into something that can do Ajax or fetch, whichever way you think about it. So I kind of see Next.js and all these meta frameworks more like a Leatherman, some badass kind of tool that you have to invest in learning. They're heavy. They're a bit, there's a lot to them. And HTMX is more like a little pocket knife. It's got a lot more in there than you actually will probably use every app. You've got things like attributes for confirms and prompt dialogues. You've got polling, WebSockets, server-side events. You can do lazy loading where if something is... an event is triggered, you'll lazily grab that HTML from the server, and it's just with attributes. So all of this advanced sort of SPA things, you can still do a fair bit of that. You've got intersection observer, so you can do infinite scrolls with just attributes. You've got some lightweight scripting with this HTMX : on, and then you can pass some event to listen to that HTMX raises and do some light inline scripting, so you don't need to go make a JavaScript file to do that sort of work. You can just stay in the HTML. There's extensions for doing smarter swaps because these swaps are very crude. They just wipe the HTML and stick in something else. There's boosting where you can take an app and just, rather than refreshing the whole page, you will just replace the body. You don't have to listen to me rattle through these. These are things we're probably not going to look at, but I wanted to kind of make this impression that it does all this stuff, and it's something you could probably invest in for some of your apps. You might not use all this stuff, but then you go to the next app and you're like, oh, actually, I need WebSockets on this app. This is great. I'll use the WebSocket bit. It's got CSS transitions and animations. It's 2024. CSS transitions aren't supported, but you're not a cool kid if you're making a framework without having your own wrapper on top of it. So it supports that. And it has some URL history API integration for being able to support that. So it does all this stuff that you don't have to write any JavaScript for, that you can access just from these attributes. But we've kind of looked at these main attributes already, and we'll kind of be coming back and forth to those. It's been super popular because of these social media coders. Like, I don't know about you guys, but in the last year, there's like 3 or 4 people on YouTube who get millions of views like this person, and they really have a big influence on what we're starting to look at and think about in the coding world. So this is HTMX in 100 seconds, and it's had 1 million views. So it's something I think people are interested in HTMX, but it's still very early days. So this, I think, is mostly driven by the fact that it's just crazy town complexity for us to do front end at the moment. And this is kind of bringing back some old ideas to have an easier way of doing it. So this is the stars, the GitHub history stars for HTMX. And you can just see this huge ramp up last year. And the NPM downloads, same sort of thing. It's this increase of stuff happening, but it's pretty recent. And if you were to think, oh, wow, that's massive, this thing's taking off, and I think it is, if you actually compare it to the big 4, like React, 20 million, this is NPM downloads a month, Angular and Vue, which are just baselining there in the blue and yellow at 5 million-ish downloads a month. And then Svelte's like at 1 million. And then go further down and you're at Htmx. And you can't even see it on the chart. I don't know exactly the numbers here. But my point is it takes a long time to really kick one of these things out or bring something else in. So Htmx, I think, is going to be super popular, but I don't think it's going to be this million download kick it like everyone stops using React sort of thing. But it doesn't need to be. But it's awesome that we have, this diversity of tools. So I'm going to jump into some code because that's the best way to look at this. And we're going to do some progressive enhancement. So this is our wonderful app with no JavaScript. This is just straight HTML. I have someone who said, why are you using anchor tags? That's terrible. But that's what you would do if you're not going to use any JavaScript, because I can actually call the server from an anchor tag with a href and actually do a get to my server. And the same with this form tag. This input here is wrapped in a form. I can do a post, and I'll show you that in a second. Actually, it's so simple. We can just look at the HTML down here at the bottom. I'll just zoom in a little bit on that and come up. And you can see we have a form with an action and a method to do a post, just normal HTML stuff, and a button. And then I have an unordered list with a couple of LIs. And in there I have an anchor tag with a delete that's doing a get. So it's just standard stuff. I can just click delete, whole page refreshes. That sucks. This is why we went down this whole spa path. And if I try and add something in here, I get another full page refresh. It looks fast because I'm running it on my laptop, but really this is the stuff we moved away from. But I think this is really interesting about HTMX. This is where HTMX begins. Nothing, first step, HTMX belongs here. Go a long way down the road, HTMX still working great for you. But if you're thinking about where does Angular and React and all those things start, they start way down the road from here. Like you've got to commit to one of them, you've got to npm install it, then you've got to have a build system, and then you've got to run with npm package management and all this sort of stuff. So this is kind of, I think, a really interesting idea of like, well, how do we kind of bring it back a bit from all this complexity? So we're going to just change this up with a few attributes, the 4 really major ones, to not do a full page refresh and clean up some of this jank of being restricted to only anchor tags and form fields to do AJAX requests, and also clean up the fact that we can only do a get on this anchor tag. So I'm going to pop over here. Now, who writes JavaScript on the server? Who writes Node stuff? All right, a few people. Who's C#? All right, a fair few. Go. Oh, one person at the back. Okay. So there's a bunch of different server-side stuff here. I happen to be a front-end developer and I'm writing a JavaScript server here, but it's useless. It means nothing. I'm not interested in my web server today. What I'm interested in is inside of one of these handlers, and this will look very common to a lot of people. You've got a get, a post, another get, and then you've got some path that you match on for your backend, and then you've got some handler here, and I'll expose this in a second. Inside of this handler, I'm doing, most of them have a little bit of SQL here, like this SQL, just inline to go get it. This is not a production app. I want it to be basic and just one file so that we don't focus on any of that. There's no error handling. My type safety is crap. Like I'm not abstracting anything out of those handlers into other files. All I want us to focus on today is what's happening in this HTML string that I'm returning. And I'm even using just a crappy string, like it's just a string of Java, a string here that I'm manipulating with JavaScript to bring back a bunch of HTML in here. And that's what's important, because it doesn't matter what web server you use, what language you want to write in, as long as it can return HTML, which they all can, you're free to now take yourself on the server and extend how much further closer you can go to the client with all of your work. Because if you can return HTML, whatever templating language, CSHTML, Razor Pages, Temples, or JSX, heaven forbid, that's what I'd probably use because I'm a JavaScript developer, you can go use that. But we're not using it today. We're just going to use basic strings. So here I have a HTML document. This is our like page level load because we're going to return little partials. And I've got a head here, and I'm not returning any JavaScript yet. So I'm just going to put back in this script tag for HTMX. HTMX, this is coming from the CDN, but if you want to get it from NPM, you can. Even if you go to GitHub, and this is kind of crazy about HTMX, if you go look at their source code, it's one file. It's like huge file, like 30 kilobytes, uncompressed. And that's a bit controversial, but I think it shows you the philosophy of the people where it's coming from is like, why do we need all this complexity? I'm just going to write one big file. Makes it easier to debug. I have no build system, blah, blah. So here we've got Htmx at the top, and then we've got our form that's just a vanilla form, and then I'm iterating over the to-dos I'm getting, mapping over those, and making an li. And it's here that I want to start on this anchor tag. So I don't like the fact that I can only do a get, and I have to put delete in my URL because I'm working around this limitation. So I want to get rid of this, and I don't want to do a href. I want to do a hx delete to my server. And that's it. There's no backing file. There's no JavaScript file. That's all I need to do. And I don't want to do an anchor tag because someone was pressuring me before about how it didn't look right for them. So I'm going to turn this into a button. So I have this button, and I still need to do a little bit more work to declare what this swap is going to be like. But not so much the swap, more so much like the target. Remember, I've kind of been talking about triggers, targets, swaps, and posts or deletes. And they're the main 4 attributes you'll put on here. So this is looking pretty simple. I want to do a delete, and then I want to say, well, what do I want to do here in terms of the swap? So I want to say hx swap, and I want to swap out the outer HTML, just remove the whole thing here. And there's only really about 6 things you pass into this swap, so this is just one of them. But now I'm going to have to update my endpoint because I've just, removed the delete word, turned my endpoint into a delete. So if I scroll down here, you can see the delete handler, or it's a get, but I'm going to change it right now to be listening for delete calls. And it's pretty simple. I just suck the ID out of the params. I'm doing some inline SQL here just to go delete it. And at the moment, I'm doing old school redirecting back to the to-dos, yeah? That's a full page refresh. We don't want to do that. And this is kind of the beginning of like, okay, Htmx is simpler, but you've still got to learn Htmx. You've still got to go learn the conventions. So Htmx has this convention that if I return an empty 200 back from my web server, however you would do it, it doesn't matter how you do it in your web server, and Htmx is the one who sent the delete, it's listening for what's coming back. It's got this architecture for listening for the response going out of your front end and the request going out of your front end, the response coming back, and doing all these hooks. So it knows just by convention, if I return an empty 200 from a delete, then I'm just going to take it out of the HTML for you. So it's pretty simple. So if we go back here now, and I remember to refresh the page, we've got some buttons. If we look at the network traffic, we're getting 16 kilobytes gzipped of HTMX now. We've definitely got JavaScript there. We just don't have to write it. And if I click delete, you'll see that a 200 call came back. And if we look at this, this is a delete to our endpoint, and it's returning nothing. We're not getting any HTML back because we just want to wipe it out. It's a delete, yeah? So you're probably going, okay, this is pretty boring and pretty simple, and that's the good point. This is pretty simple and is pretty boring. It's really easy to do that, and I didn't need to do a full page refresh for it to happen. And I think it's worth slowing down and thinking about that, the pattern that we're doing here versus the tool of Htmx. Okay, so let's move on here, but you'll see, let me just refresh here, delete, and it's not quite working right, is it? There's kind of a problem here that I'm coming back and my li is still sitting here. So I deleted the button, but I didn't delete the whole li. And this comes back, like, it's one of the small debugging things you'll do, is I'm swapping out the outer HTML of just the button, but I didn't actually say, hey, wait a second, I want to swap the whole li. So this is where you start going into the other ones and you say, actually, what I want to do is a hx target. And what I didn't plan this, by the way, I just stuffed up. But this shows you how simple it is. I'm like, oh yeah, I must have stuffed. Oh yeah, I didn't say what I want to target to do this swap. It's not that tricky. So I want to do this target here. What do I want to target on the page? Well, I want to target this li. So I'm going to say, I want you to find the closest, if I can spell this morning, closest, and I'll just, Copilot, that's not what I want. The closest li. And I want you to target that and then swap its outer HTML and just wipe it out. So if I come back, refresh the page, we haven't got a to-do, so learn HTMX, Duncan. And then if I delete that, then it just wipes the whole thing out. So you've got these targets where you can reach around anywhere in the DOM on the page and swap out those parts. And that's going to become more important as you start to need to swap two things at once and other sorts of stuff. But it's at this point here, we've got a working delete. So I'm going to pop back over and do one more thing to clean up not needing to do a full page refresh and do the same sort of love here onto our form. So here we've got just the native action and method, but we don't need two things here. We can just say, I want to do a HX post. Here's HX post to to-dos. Don't need the method because it's kind of in the attribute name of Htmx post above. And then I need to say again, what am I targeting? So I want to go and make a new to-do and then return it in another li item and stick it in this unordered list here. So then I'm going to need to say again this target. So HX target is going to be my next unordered list. So you can just use an ID or any sort of query selector sort of syntax here, CSS selector to find things. But there's also these weird helpers everywhere with, you know, I'm passing in a string that has 3 or 4 different things that it's doing. Is it a DSL? It's just some weirdness of Htmx, but it's awesome because you don't have to go make a JavaScript file. You'll figure out what you want to do and you can do quite a lot. It's quite expressive in some of these things in this way that you do it. So what's the swap we want to do? We don't want to replace the whole UL. We just want to stick something at the top of it. So I want to do a swap is going to be equal to after begin. So I want to just swap out what's after begin. I don't need to do a HX trigger here because submit, the event coming off this would trigger it, is just the default for a form. Same with the button. I didn't need to put a click on the button because Htmx is like, you're on a button or you're on a form. I kind of know the defaults that you want. So this is a form. I kind of know that the default's going to be a submit trigger, so I'm not going to need to put it there. But you could put in multiple triggers. You can listen for a mouse over or a hover or something else happening on your page. Any event, you can listen to it. And we're going to need to come down, steal this bit of li, and this is where it'd be nice to have some composable function to be able to not have duplicated HTML, but I'll leave that up to you and your web server to solve. And I'm not going to do a redirect on my post. Here I'm just pulling the name property off the form, which is the single input. I've got a commented out SQL for later. And then I've just got this little bit of SQL that's just going to insert the new to-do. So it's pretty straightforward. And then I'm going to return HTML now, just to replace the bit that I want. Don't worry, we're going to be through this simple demo in a second and we'll go back to some slides, but good to close the loop out here. So just going to make a string and paste that in here. Now, because this is a post, I kind of already have the name there, but I don't have a full to-do, so I'm just going to change this. And I got the ID back from my insert, so I'm just going to grab the ID like this. So now I'm kind of making new state, putting it into the HTML and sending that state down just back in HTML. So I don't have to save this state in the client, I don't have to do any of that sort of stuff. And I've got just a handful of lines to do the whole job. And I'm going to refresh the page and say get milk. And if we look at the network traffic, let me just clear this network traffic out and say get milk to. This is a post to the to-dos that just returned the li item. I didn't do a full page refresh. And hopefully right now you're going, okay, I've seen enough of that over and over, Duncan. I'm getting it. Let's move on to some other stuff because we are. But that's just all I sent back. And I think once you get this, you're like, I could probably write that myself. Like it's not that complicated. So yeah, but now we have basically a mini spa just for this page, no page refreshes, super fast, no JavaScript to hydrate except for Htmx, but we didn't have to write any JavaScript. All right, where are our slides? So I think we've seen enough now to kind of go, okay, I know what Htmx is. I know what it means for me to write some HTML on my server, and I know how it's going to swap and stuff. Should I use it? You know, what's in it for you? What sort of app should you use it for? And I think the real sweet spot here of why people are using it is because it's just simpler, yeah? It's much simpler than a spa like Angular or React or those sorts of things. Should it replace that? No, I don't think it's going to make them go away. But hopefully a bunch of you are like me and you kind of get a bit starry-eyed and you're like, oh, I can think of a bunch of apps that just would be much simpler if I didn't have all that other ceremony. And they do heaps of shit posting. It's one of the weird things about Htmx. Who's seen their Twitter feed? It's just weird. Like, this isn't Google and Angular. This isn't React and Facebook. It's Carlson, some dude sitting in Montana going, screw you all. Like, I'm not some big megacorp. I'm just going to, like, whatever. So he has, like, there's these memes and other things. And people hate it and people love it, but this is off their website. And I think this is kind of the truth. Why do DB to JSON to JavaScript to HTML if you can just go DB to HTML? Why not? Some apps, I think it's going to be great. And it's fast. Simple is fast. No parsing well, you do parse the HTML in the background with Htmx, but you're not hydrating like you would a React app, and you don't have this exponentially growing bundle size that's going to slow your page speeds, and you're going to have very fast load times. But probably the coolest thing, there's so many things. I could probably do 30 points here. I've only got 2 major ones. The second major one is any backend you want. And I think that is awesome. They call it the house stack. So HTMX on whatever you like. And if you go onto YouTube right now, and I'll show you a bunch of YouTube front pages in a second, you see all these different stacks, the Beth stack, the hate stack, you know, and they're all in different languages. You can even go learn Lisp and HTMX. I don't think I asked about Lisp before. .NET, HTMX. These are YouTube front pages. Blazor and HTMX, Go and HTMX, Python and HTMX, Django, Fast API. If you're like me, I like Bun, Hono, all these JavaScripty things, you can do that as well. You want to do some Java and HTMX. You want to do some F# and HTMX. Like, this is just why I think there's so much popularity around HTMX, is that it's like whatever server you want and you can stay there. So we don't have this front-end, back-end person and this big divide, and you have to specialize in one, or you can't do one or the other, or you just have a brain meltdown trying to be an expert in both. So this back-end person with HTMX can drift way into the front end and maybe do the whole thing. So that's super cool, and that's why it's popular. Ironically, we're seeing the same thing happen the other way, but not in simplicity, but in more complexity for the front end. People in my position now need to know how to do server-side rendering with only Node. You're not going to do it in Go, for doing Next.js and all that server-side rendering. And that space is awesome, and it's getting more awesome, but geez, it's getting more complex. Like, I just want to stream my HTML down, but first can you stream down my script tags first before you then wait for my server to render in my Node app? Like, it's super powerful, but it's not getting simpler. It's getting more complex. So why should you use, or when should you use Hypermedia? Notice they don't even say when should you use HTMX. You even listen to them like, it's just a tool. But Hypermedia is the pattern. So I've kind of summarized this article and taken some bits from it to discuss. Like, if you're sitting here now going, okay, Duncan, I'm interested enough in it. When should I maybe use it? What's a good fit? I think a good fit is when you have, or this is just from them, and I'll say some of them I personally think is a great fit, but mostly when you just got text and images. If you don't need to do any JavaScript, why have React for it? If you're just sending HTML down, it's an awesome tool to have. But as soon as you need to do something cruddy, as soon as you have a form, I bet no one here does forms because we don't do much of them in web development, but yeah, it's probably some people laughing because that's all we do, or all I do. And if that's what you're doing, HTMX is awesome. Like, you can take a form. I'll show you some server-side and client-side validation in a second. HTMX is a great fit for that. It's really good at updating 3 or 4 spots on a page based off responding with HTML. So if you've got 4 distinct sections and 2 of them need to change and you want to swap out 2 sections, not too bad, complexity is pretty low. But if you've got 20 or 30 different spots, then the complexity is pretty high. So kind of missed a point there, but nested updates in blocks, easy. And deep linking page renders super fast. So if you want to have a fast first page render, maybe some of your site doesn't use React. If you have a page, your home page needs to be fast with a form on it, use HTMX. And then when you authenticate and go into your mega app, then maybe you use React. So HTMX can be just an add-on. When's it a bad fit? I think the idea is when you get to lots of stuff on the page that needs to know about updating. if you've got 10, 15 things, like a Facebook page with a badge and a sidebar and a post and 15 bits, you have to return 15 pieces of HTML from your server and insert them in 15 different places. Probably the spot where you're like, maybe HTMX for this page, not a good idea. Next three require offline functionality. Your UI state changes frequently, or your team just don't like your idea of HTMX. You could insert X framework for any of these, yeah? Like, you're not doing React offline. You might, but it's going to be bespoke. And your UI state updating frequently, like React, Facebook, all those things. It's super chatty over the wire with JSON. And team not being on board, geez, we're just flame wars all the way down. So hopefully that gives you an idea that CRUD app, that's the sweet spot. So let's jump over and look at a little bit more code, because I think we've looked at this idea that we've got this app here that's really basic, and we've stopped at needing to do a full page refresh. But you're going to hit a couple of things straight away. And one of them is going to be with a form. How do I do server-side validation? So if I delete this and I push enter, I get that beautiful client-side validation, styled terribly, but it's just default client-side validation. I can't submit the form. And HTMX is aware of that. It works very well with just basic web standards. But if I want to stop someone, just hypothetically, I want to say I can't add get milk twice because of the same name. So if I say get milk, I want to stop this and I want to show a red error underneath. How do I do that when I'm returning just HTML? Because that's not part of my post returning of this LI at the moment. Now I need to return maybe the LI, but if validation fails, I want to stick a red error message underneath the form. So now you're at that step 2 of HTMX where you've got to do an out-of-bounds swap, or you've got to update multiple parts on the page. And this out-of-bounds swaps is one of the main strategies. So I'm going to go back over onto our server here, and up here, underneath our form that's been, improved by using HTMX, I'm just going to put a div underneath here with an ID on it of error. It's just an empty div that's going to sit here and do nothing. But it's a spot for me to know about that I can target and swap out that error message now. But what I want to do is I want to actually be able to swap it out in conjunction with also swapping out my LI item. So I've now got to swap out 2 spots. So how do I do that? How do I handle like server-side validation? And I'm going to do that in the post method down here. I'm going to come down and uncomment this little bit of SQL that I've got for doing some server-side validation. You don't need to read the SQL. It's basically saying, hey, do you already have a to-do with that name in the SQL? If so, set this existing to-do to be that to-do, and I can then do an if statement on it. So before I get to this point here of actually saving the to-do in the post, I'm just going to do an if statement and say, if there is an existing to-do, I want you to do something else. I want you to return some other HTML. So return c.html, and inside of here, I'm just going to return a div of ID error because that's what we've got there. But I also want to put a message inside of here. I want to say the to-do already exists. Yeah. But how does HTMX know that in the response from the server, there's going to be multiple bits of HTML and I want you to swap this thing with an ID of error? So you've got another attribute for that. And HTMX is going to be listening for a hx swap OOB equals true. And then it's going to swap this out for us. And I'm writing that in the wrong spot. But everyone's paying attention. That's good. No one's fallen asleep. It's not too complicated. That should be up here. And I'm just sprinkling. Oh, jeez. You guys are paying attention. Okay. Okay. I'll put some color on it. I'm front-end dev. I've got to have some styles. So I'm just going to do some inline style here and say that the color is red. Obviously, you'd use CSS, and that's a good point here. What's your styling going to be for this toolkit? CSS, just like every other front end. So if you want to make it look as shizzly as any other front end, you can, because it's just CSS. You can go get frameworks. Someone here before was saying they're using Bootstrap and the Bootstrap modals and other things with their HTMX, and they're loving it. So free to do whatever styling you want. So I've got this here, but I haven't quite finished this div higher up because I need to come up to this div and say, I actually want to do a certain type of swap. So I'm going to do a hx swap here equals the outer HTML. Notice there's no trigger on this. There's no fetch. I'm not fetching this HTML again because it's coming back from doing some other sort of work here, and it's going to be on the page. So I come back and refresh, delete one of these and say get milk. Now I'm going to get that inserted in there. And if I look down here, here is the payload coming back, is just that little bit there being swapped in surgically wherever you want. So you can imagine having 3 or 4 of these out of bounds swaps. Update the badge with the count of how many emails are on my page, update the fact that this one's red, and then you hit a certain limit where you're doing so much of this swap that you're like, oh, it's getting a bit complex to understand how many things to swap. And there's strategies for that. So we've got this, but we've now got the problem if I say get milk 2, it passes, but my error message is still here. So come back, pretty simple thing to do. I'm just going to come here and say, if you make it past this if statement, because there is no existing to do with that name, I'm just going to put back into this spot here, this thing here. Just going to put the empty one back in. So I'll come down and I'm just going to put it back underneath here with the li, which feels kind of weird when you do it for the first time because it's not really running HTML at this point. It's like 2 different bits of HTML coming back and HTMX figuring out where to swap it for you. But you get used to it and you get your brain wrapped around it pretty quick. So now at this point, if I was to say existing to do 3, oh, sorry, I've got to refresh the page and say get milk. It says it already exists. Get milk 2 already exists, and I've stuffed something up again. So how complicated can HTMX be? So let's have a look here. What did I forget? Can anyone point it out for me here? How does HTMX know that it needs to swap this out? Exactly. So you're seeing some live debugging here and some terrible typing. But what you're seeing here is that this stuff is just so easy. Like I'm stuffing up left, right, and center and I just catch it really quickly. I'm not like going through real big dramas to kind of go, oh, why didn't it swap? Okay. So now refresh the page. Hopefully I got it right. And I'm talking big about myself, but get milk 2, get milk 2 again, get milk 3, and it gets rid of it. So pretty simple stuff. So I'm going to pop out of this code demo in a second and come back and talk about some of this glue code that you might need to do, this 10% of JavaScript. But I want to kind of dive under the covers a little bit here and have a look at how HTMX is working and where you can hook into stuff, because it's still a little bit magical. We know we've stuck this JavaScript file in there and it's doing these swaps, but there's all this events happening underneath the covers here and it's not hidden away from you. I can just come down into the console here and say HTMX because it's a global JavaScript file sitting on the global object, and I can go find its log all method and I can execute that here in the bottom down here. So when I fire a delete now, I just get spewed all the information of all the different events that are coming out of HTMX that you can hook into here. It's not so easy to read, so let's just make our own little logger here. So I'm going to make a HTMX logger that equals my own function that I'm going to return that will take the element and, sorry, the first argument will be the event, and then the element dot tag name. And then I'm just going to console dot log. Sorry, let me come back here. I want this bit. And I'm just going to console log the element.tag name and the event. So don't need to memorize this or learn it, but I find it handy to log out just some of those bits rather than spewing out everything here. So now when I click delete, we should be able to see that I've... You guys are really paying attention. This is good. Let's fix that. And now we can see in here the element that's coming out and undefined. Did I get it backwards? So we're getting this backwards. Element first, event second. And now you can see all the things that are happening. These are all the hooks that you can hook into that are just basic events happening in the browser. So you've got a HTMX trigger on the button, a config request, validate URL. These are all the lifecycle methods that HTMX is doing in the background. Before request, before send, load start, and then there's a swap happening on an LI, and then there's some cleanup, and then there's an after load, after request, and all these hooks. And that is the bits that allow you to be able to then craft and compose with HTMX to say, I need to put some security header on when you're making this request. You can hook into that event, grab the header, put on your security, and then do the post. So it's very simple, like everything in HTMX, to be able to do that next step and override things inside of here. So I just wanted to show that because it's a single file, all these events, you can just set a breakpoint in that single file if you're not using the compressed version and just debug their source code. It's that easy, so it's pretty cool. All right, let's shuffle on here and talk about some of this glue code that you're probably going to need to do and what are you going to choose to do it. And we'll have a look at what I think is exciting, which is web components, which no one else thinks is exciting, but it is. Oh, a couple of thumbs up, that's good. Anyone else like web components? Oh, yeah. Good. It's 2024, finally. People are using them. Last year, one person. So, glue code. You're going to have to need to do things. This is all running on the server. I didn't send down a script tag. If I do document.querySelect, if I just let me show you this. If I try and come into this post and return a document.querySelector here and run it, it's going to run on the server because it's not yet in the client. I'm just returning the HTML. If you want to run that on the client, you're going to need to put it in a script tag and run it. So there's certain things that you're going to need to do that's this sort of glue code, this little bit of scripting. The most popular thing you'll see people do is they'll use something like Alpine.js, which is like a modern jQuery, and it allows you to do kind of a little bit of state management and client-side scripting kind of inline in a. So this is an example of a div that has some state on it with x-data open to false. So I'm setting this open state inline. I've got a click handler on the button that's toggling the open state from true to false. And then I've got xShow on the div that is when the open is true, it's going to show that div. And it kind of, you don't need to read this, but it kind of looks terrible like this if it's, but for me, on the page, trying to do less work in the client with HTMX. I would probably prefer to just take it out of the page and then go back to the server and get my content to show as HTML and then stick it back into the page. But a lot of people like Alpine, a lot of people like this little tiny manipulation still in the client. So I wanted to show it because it's a popular way of doing it. But for me, I'm like, my experience so far with HTMX is every page is a full refresh. Interacting like with a form, then I don't refresh the page. But when I go to my next page, I just refresh the whole thing. So if I need to do 10% more, I just use JavaScript. I'll just put a script tag on the page and just add my event listener, my click, whatever, and I'll just do it there because it's not going to turn into jQuery spaghetti from early 2000s because 90% of that jQuery spaghetti is gone because of HTMX doing what it's doing. So I would prefer to just write JavaScript. Most people won't. Most people probably use Alpine. All right. I'm excited that we have 10 minutes to talk about web components and that there's a few champions in the room. This is good. So I really like web components. They've got a terrible API. I've spent 2 years just writing web components every day of the week for the government building a design system. So I'm very comfortable to open a terminal and write a web component just straight out in JavaScript and run it because they're web standards. They run anywhere. They're just JavaScript, and you can see all the browser support here from NDN. But their API is terrible, like very low level, and that's one of the main reasons why I don't think they're super popular, that yet, unless you're building a design system. But if you're going to be you're a C# developer and you're doing HTML in razor tags or in CSHTML, is that what it's called? Yeah. You're doing it all over there, then you probably don't want to then go reach for some component library, going to drag you down some path to have to use React or something else. And you don't want to because you're using Htmx. So where are you going to get your component library? Well, probably Bootstrap is one good option. You can use Tailwind, but then you don't get really fancy drop downs, because Tailwind, when you want to go get the fanciness of it, you need to go use the React or Vue components. So you need to go reach for something. And I think web components is a really good fit for this. And there is not much choice for web component libraries that aren't design systems for a specific look and feel. But Shoelace, shout out to them, is awesome. And that's probably what I would use and we're using to write a bunch of web components to do our components when we're using Htmx. So if I need a drop down, I need a disclosure, I need to do some, spinners and everything else, I'm going to probably use web components because I don't need to reach for a React library and have that complexity. I said I really love them, and I think a great way to learn Htmx is obviously to rewrite it for yourself. So that's what I've gone and done. I went and read their big, massive file, and it's not too complicated. And everything I'm about to show you now hardly works. It's terribly written, but it is an example of what I think is actually really exciting, and I wish I could just reach for off the shelf with Shoelace and do, which is to be able to not have all of Htmx. I want to have more of a spork, just a little bit, something super, super useful that is a mix of having web components that will do all my declarative markup and improve the native ability, but also give me this ability to do fetch requests and all this hypermedia pattern. But I don't want to pay for Htmx. I don't want to have any library. I just want to write vanilla JavaScript top to bottom, everything my team's done, and that's what you could do here. So again, this is Duncanism. It's all just me playing around. None of this runs in production. It's just but I've gone and made a bunch of custom UI-form. These are custom elements, and it enhances a normal form. Plus, it does all of the fetch request stuff. Now, I didn't call it HX. I just called it fetch because I used fetch, just a choice. But it does similar sorts of things. And then I've got a UI input. I'm able to supercharge this input field and say, I want a label as an attribute, and I want a help text as an attribute, and I'll side validate the constraints API, but I don't like their messaging and their look. So I want to supercharge this component to show my own type of validation. And then the button, I want it to show a spinner without me having to tell it when the form's doing an AJAX request. So this is like this weird blend of an idea of saying, I want this declarative markup that's so awesome from Htmx, but I want it to be supercharged with web components. I want it to be super tiny and surgical like Htmx is, but I want to just do it all with my own JavaScript. So this simple little demo, I'll just come out of full screen here and bring up this one, go back into full screen. This is what it looks like. And I'll show you a bit more of the HTML underneath in a second, but because this is a custom web component, I can just put an attribute there of the label, which is new to do, and a help text. And then this is my own custom web component. So it's got its own custom styling that's encapsulated in it. And you can see the terrible styling with the focus outline there, but that's not the point. But if I say enter, I get my own. This is just client-side validation. You know that ugly pop-up we saw before with the browser's default message? This is just me hooking into the browser's system and showing that with just native browser tools. So there's no other libraries and stuff involved. And it's kind of giving me better styling, all in that declarative markup. So get milk here. And when I push this, you'll see it's not a perfect library. My fetch to the spinner is a bit slow. But when and my database is terribly slow. I think it's sitting in like Amsterdam or something. So when I click this, it goes, hey, do you really want to do this? And this is my dialog. It's not the browser's dialog. And I triggered it just by putting an attribute that says hx confirm string yes, add it. So I can get all of this just from attributes plus my own custom elements, my custom styling, all of those things. So I'm going to say yes. And now the button's disabled, the spinner starts. and then it jams it in below. So hopefully some people can see not the beauty of this UX. This is terrible UX. But the idea is the fact that you've got this declarative markup that's extending just all of our natural abilities with web components and being able to do all of that in a really simple way all yourself. It's not too tricky to do. And if we come down to the bottom here and we look at the network traffic, and I'll just refresh the page again, the times are pretty slow, like I said, because my HTML to-do page has got to hit a server in some other place than where the function's running. But this is showing you some real sizes here of some of these elements. So I have a form component, it's 2 kilobytes compressed, an icon component for the spinner 1.2, the input 2.8, the buttons 1.8, the dialog is 1, and this index is like my core logic that has that HTMX-y stuff. It's not even a kilobyte. So, you know, these are tiny payloads, tiny sets of work. And I think it's cool to see that you're like, wow, the web's getting far enough forward that you can just do all this with it, and you can do hypermedia with your own web components and do it in this really performant way. So I'm going to stop at this point, talk about last thing about what's the future for HTMX and hypermedia. I think that it's very bright. Will it knock off the big 4 Angular, React, Vue and so forth? I don't think so. I think, but it's going to get more traction. You get more kind of enthusiasts like me building stuff with it, and a bunch of other people, especially because of that whole server-side bring whatever you want story. There is going to be a version 2. There's already an alpha of version 2. You can go read about it. The good thing about it is it's not really that big of a change. It's still just going to be as awesome. It's still a single file, which is controversial. They're dropping support for Internet Explorer. They're dropping a few things that they want to into extensions. And they're improving some of the stuff that's been quirky. But it's still about the same size. You can go listen, you know, they don't take anything seriously. So you go listen to the music and look at race bikes on their website. And their branch names are terrible. And anyway, you can go have a look. But it's exciting. I think there's going to be a new version. Heaps of people into it. This is open source. People are contributing. It's not just the main person anymore. It's pretty awesome. So at that point, just want to say thanks. If you're using it and you're around the conference, come have a chat. If you have any questions and you're around at the after party tonight, always love to geek out on this stuff. And thank you very much.